Have you ever just had that gut feeling that some things are, well, just plain wrong? No matter what the law says or what everyone else seems to think? Well, the theory of natural law says that's no accident. The whole idea is that we're all born with a kind of moral user manual, an innate guide to right and wrong that's literally woven into our human nature. And that brings us to the huge question we're tackling here. Are we actually born knowing the difference between right and wrong? Is there some kind of universal moral code out there that we can figure out just by, looking at ourselves?
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to explore this idea of an inbuilt moral compass. Then we'll get into the specific rules that this compass supposedly gives us. After that, we're going to put the whole theory to the test with 3 big modern challenges. And finally, we'll see how it deals with the really messy, gray areas of modern ethics.
Okay, to really get a grip on this built-in compass, we have to travel back in time to a really powerful idea from ancient Greece. It's the concept that underpins this entire theory: purpose, or as they called it, telos. So this all kicks off with Aristotle. He argued that everything in the universe, and I mean everything, from a rock to a person, has a telos. That's its ultimate goal, its endpoint that it's always striving for. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas took this idea and gave it a divine upgrade. For Aquinas, this purpose wasn't just random. No way. It was designed by God as part of a grand, benevolent plan. Think about it like this. It's super simple. An acorn's telos, its whole purpose, is to grow into a massive oak tree. That's its natural endgame. Aquinas said, hey, we humans have a telos too. Our purpose is to achieve what he called eudaimonia, which isn't just about being happy. It's about complete human flourishing, reaching our full potential. And when we do that, we glorify God. So how on earth are we supposed to figure all this out? Well, according to Aquinas, God didn't leave us in the dark. He gave us an incredible tool: reason. This light of reason, as he puts it, lets us examine our own nature and discover the moral laws that guide us toward that ultimate goal. It's what separates us from animals. They're just driven by instinct, but we have the free will to choose to follow this path, or not. Okay, so if we have this built-in moral guide, how do we actually read it? How do we go from this big, fuzzy idea of purpose to actual specific rules for how to live our lives? Let's take a look at how Aquinas breaks down this moral manual into a real system of rules. Aquinas saw all law as a kind of pyramid. Right at the very top, you have the eternal law. That's God's cosmic master plan for everything, which is mostly unknowable to us. A little piece of that gets revealed to us through Scripture. That's what he called divine law. Then there's the part we can actually figure out on our own, just by using our brains, and that's natural law. Finally, at the bottom are our everyday human laws, which are only legitimate if they line up with all the levels above them. So what does our reason actually discover? Aquinas says it points us to 5 basic, non-negotiable goals. He called them the primary precepts. And these aren't just random rules from a book. They come from observing our own fundamental human drives. The drive to survive, to learn, to live together in a community, to have kids, and to seek God. They're the core purposes that are basically hardwired into our nature. Now, from those really broad principles, we then have to use our practical reason and our conscience to work out the nitty-gritty rules for daily life. These are the secondary precepts. So, for example, if you take the primary precept, protect and preserve human life, a follower of natural law would reason their way to the secondary precept that euthanasia must be morally wrong. See? This is how the theory gets from the big picture down to the concrete. But let's be real for a second. How does a theory from the 1200s actually hold up today? I mean, a lot has changed. So let's put it to the test and look at 3 major challenges from modern science, culture, and even from theology itself. The first challenge, and it's a big one, comes straight from modern science. Thinkers like Sean Carroll and Richard Dawkins would argue that this whole idea of telos is basically a fantasy. Science can explain the universe just fine with things like physics and evolution. We don't need to believe in some preordained purpose. From their perspective, the universe doesn't have a why. It just has a what and a how. And then you've got the cultural challenge. Look, if we're all reading from the same moral user manual, then why do different cultures have such wildly different ideas about right and wrong? Psychologists like Freud argued our moral compass isn't built in at all. It's built by our parents and our society. This whole idea suggests morality is all about nurture, not nature. And finally, a really powerful critique comes from inside theology itself. Theologians like Karl Barth made the case that after the biblical fall of man,
our human reason became corrupted by sin. So trying to rely on our own minds to figure out God's morality isn't just unreliable, it's dangerously arrogant. It's a kind of idolatry. For Barth, the only safe path to moral truth is faith in God's direct revelation in the Bible, period.
Okay, so despite these really heavy-hitting challenges, natural law hasn't just disappeared. In fact, it's developed some pretty sophisticated tools for dealing with the complex, messy dilemmas we face in the real world, where the answers aren't so black and white. One of the key tools in its toolkit is something called the doctrine of double effect. This is a principle for situations where one action is going to have two outcomes, one good and one bad. It says that the action might be morally okay, but only if the bad outcome was just a foreseen side effect, not what you actually intended to happen. The bad effect has to be, as Aquinas said, beside the intention. But for this to work, you have to pass a strict four-part test. First, your actual intention has to be for the good outcome. That's non-negotiable. Second, the bad result can't be the way you achieve the good one. Third, the good has to be big enough to justify the unintended harm. And finally, the action itself can't be something that's just always wrong, like, say, targeting an innocent person. Now, that last idea that some actions are always wrong has been challenged by a more modern way of thinking called proportionalism. Proportionalists, like B. House, argue that no act is evil all by itself. An act only becomes wrong if it fails to create a proportionate amount of good over evil. This, of course, gives you a lot more flexibility than the old-school natural law. But defenders of the traditional view, like Pope John Paul II, pushed back, and they pushed back hard. He argued that certain acts are always intrinsically wrong because they fundamentally violate our human nature. Sure, a good intention might make you less guilty, but it can never, ever turn an evil act into a good one. And to really see how absolutist this worldview is, get this. Cardinal Newman put it in the most extreme terms possible. He basically said it would be better for the entire cosmos to collapse than for one person to commit even one small sin. For the traditional natural law theorist, upholding the moral law is more important than any consequence on Earth, no matter how catastrophic. The rules are the rules. So at the end of the day, this leaves us with a really crucial question to think about. Is morality a fixed, absolute code that's written into our very nature for us to discover? Or is it more like a flexible tool that we have to constantly adapt and change to try and create the best possible outcomes in a complicated, messy world? How you answer that question really shapes not just what you believe, but how you live your life.